This is part 3 of Depression and Political Crisis in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And this is the portion in which we deal with Brazil. Just to remind ourselves, we're dealing with the radical changes brought about by the Great Depression, the unique role of the middle class, and how the Depression had really challenged the liberal economic order of dependence on commodity production and export. Now, while Chile moves in the mid-1930s to this democratic government that's very left-wing, and Argentina in 1930 moves to a very dictatorial right-wing government, Brazil is kind of harder to pin down. There's one man in charge in this entire period, but he changes course a lot. In 1930, there was a broad alliance of people who brought down what's known as the Old Republic. The Old Republic is a politics that was put in place after the fall of the monarchy in 1889, and it's really the politics of the strongest states, of the states of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. Now, Sao Paulo was known as a coffee producer, and Minas Gerais, which was a mineral producer in the colonial period, is a big dairy state in the early 20th century. And so this is known as a política de café con leche. In other words, the politics of coffee, Sao Paulo, and milk, or with milk. And those two states really dominated everything. And the political crisis, along with the Great Depression, opened the door for a challenge to this. And the challenge came from a man named Getúlio Vargas, who was from the southernmost state of Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul. We're going to look at the map in the next slide. But he and some oligarchs and some elites from other states who were upset with Sao Paulo, so there were even some elites from Minas Gerais, along with some middle-class groups and modernizing segments of the military. The workers have absolutely no political role here. They get together and they overthrow the old regime. And what they do really does change Brazil. So let's just take a quick look at Brazil. So if you look in red, you can see Sao Paulo and Minas. And while Minas is bigger than Sao Paulo is the richest state in Brazil by far. And so those two states really dominated politics in this period, from the end of the monarchy to 1930. And Vargas is from that southern state, you can see in yellow, Rio Grande do Sul. And he makes alliances with people from various states, and it's pretty close to a bloodless coup. And there he is, he's in the uniform on the right, and he's not really a military man, he's a politician, on his way to take power in Rio in 1930. Now, what really distinguishes Vargas from his predecessors is the predecessors were really almost only interested in promoting export agriculture from their states, that all infrastructure spending, everything was about the coffee economy, any kind of export economy, and they were not interested in unifying the nation. They weren't really interested in having any other economy other than an export economy, and they certainly had a very closed political system. So Vargas is supported by a group of people we can call modernizers. A key group was the so-called tenentes, which is sort of Portuguese for lieutenants. These were younger military men who rejected the role of the military as solely supporting big landowners. They felt that the military should be this great force to tie this huge nation together and to make it modern. So they were really rejecting the status quo. Now, as I said, before 1930, every state was really just operated as a state. And the national government in Rio was quite weak because it was an extreme case of federalism. In other words, states' rights really ruled supreme here. So when Vargas came to power in 1930, what he decided to do was to try to centralize more power in the national capital, which again is Rio. The capital moves to Brasilia in 1960. Brasilia is built in the 50s. There's nothing there in 1930. So Vargas takes some of these young military men and he makes them literally interventors. They intervene in the state politics. He appoints them to state governors. He also tries to build up the national government through a series of measures. And one of the most important is to try to draw the growing working class into politics. So he creates a federal ministry of labor, and it is there specifically to regulate work, to settle strikes, and also it's not just something that's on behalf of workers. It's also on behalf of promoting the industrial sector. Now, Vargas would never do this at the expense of the rural sector. He thinks they should both grow, but he'd like to have a more variegated economy with an industrial sector to complement the agricultural sector. So this is really incredibly radical because the old way of doing things in Brazil was of the states, which were dominated by the local agricultural interests, making all the decisions and having a very weak president who came out of this state structure, but was always subservient to what the states wanted. So centralizing power in the national capital is a radical idea. Having the national capital put in the state governors is incredibly new. The Ministry of Labor, the idea that a federal ministry would actually have a role in deciding what went on in these states was really just unheard of. And a lot of this stuff is codified in a constitution which passes in 1934. It includes things like an 8-hour day and a minimum wage. Now, those things were rarely actually put in place, but those are some of the ideas behind this constitution. Women were granted the right to vote. Now, that when there were elections, women did have that right. Now, what's interesting about Brazil is that, once again, it's the middle class that's playing very much a decisive role. The elites were divided. I mean, if you go back to how Vargas came to power, it was a disagreement between Sao Paulo and Minas and Vargas from this third state. And those are all elite interests. And they're divided, and that leads to the revolution itself. Workers have no political rights at this point. They can't vote. There's a very limited franchise that has to do with property rights and having a certain amount of money. And also, Brazil, like Argentina, had a lot of anarcho-syndicalists, anarchists. There was a very tiny communist party and a very tiny socialist party. You don't have that parliamentary tradition of Chile. You had a very closed political system. So workers are not in national elections at this time. So the middle class has really no allies, no natural allies, unlike Argentina, where they can tie into segments of the elite. So the middle class tends to tie itself to Vargas and to this new regime. And that seems as though that might be a path towards pushing open democracy, because the middle class wants more and more say in things, and we can see that in granting women the right to vote, that Vargas seems to be a Democrat. And when he comes to power in 1930, he's talking about having elections, and he's talking about he had actually lost the presidential election of 1930, and it was seen as fraudulent, and that led to the coup. And he says, "Oh no, I'm a very sincere Democrat." But between the declaration that he's going to have elections and an attempt to have them, there is important opposition to him. Sao Paulo is very unhappy about losing its dominant role, and in 1932 launches a civil war that rejects Vargas's attempts to control things. Now, Vargas beats Sao Paulo in the civil war. It lasts a little bit less than a year, but he grants them tremendous concessions that the federal government will stay out of their affairs. So right there, he's limiting the federal government's role in the biggest, most powerful state. The left, such as it is, attempts a coup against Vargas in 1935. Now, this is a case, again, we have information from archives in the United States and Britain and Brazil and the former Soviet Union, now Russian archives. This was a coup attempt ordered by Moscow, and the British Secret Service knew all about it. It was quickly suppressed, and its leaders were arrested. But Vargas used this attempt to overthrow him in 1935 as a reason to cancel the elections, become increasingly dictatorial, and in 1937 he formally declared a dictatorship called the Estado Novo, which means new state. And what he said was, look, the best way to achieve everything I want is by the state to do it without people using the political system to reject it. So what we see once again is that the middle class is incredibly important in Brazil. There's no parliamentary system. There's no alliances that they can make with anything but the state itself. And so, as it was in Argentina, Chile, and therefore now in Brazil, we see the middle class plays an important role. It doesn't play the same role in each place, right? As I said, there's nothing inherently democratic about middle class. What's inherent about a middle class is it's trying to have more political say, and it's going to take whatever path is open to it. So the middle class emerges with the Great Depression as a new important actor in Latin American politics. But as I've said several times, that doesn't make it democratic. And it is important to see the different alliances were made by different middle class groups and parties in South America according to the histories of those countries, the political system that was in existence, and the traditions. So again, in Argentina, the middle class could rise to power by making ties to segments of the elite, and then making different ties in the oligarchical dictatorship of the 1930s in Argentina. In Chile, the middle class makes ties to the workers. And in Brazil, the middle class makes ties to the state. So what we see there is that the structure of politics is what shapes those alliances. The Chilean middle class turns left because it had no alternative among the elite. The Argentine middle class turned right because that was its most attractive option. And the Brazilian middle class was in some ways all over the map because it had no place else to go, but ultimately is tying into the government, and the government is sort of moving around from being democratic to dictatorial. That there's some irony, though, that it's the middle class, which is really numerically very, very small in these countries. It's concentrated in cities. It's among kind of rising professionals. That these small and politically weak middle classes have a dramatic impact on politics. But why do they have a dramatic impact on politics? Because it's in 1930 is such an important pivot in Latin American history. This is when everything that has been put in place from the 1850s on of the liberal export economy comes crushing down with the World Depression. And it's starting to challenge many of the assumptions Latin American elites have about their place in the world. And if we go back to the very first lectures, we think about Creole elites. What they want is they want to become national elites who can plug into this expanding globalized world economy and sell their commodities without sending a cut of it to Spain or Portugal. So the entire orientation, with the brief exception of Paraguay, is to produce commodities and profit in the world market. Now, with the Great Depression, that gets called into question. And not only does it get called into question, it gets called into question in a period with more and more people in politics, with new media for communication, whether it's magazines and newspapers or radio and newsreels, that we're getting more and more people participating in politics and questioning, first of all, the efficacy of the liberal economic export model, and secondly, why there's no popular participation. Where's the political liberalism? We seem to have economic liberalism that's failed and no political liberalism. And so those are important questions going forward, and it's important to look at the 30s as a very interesting pivot in Latin American history. And as I said before, this is something that happens a little bit earlier in Mexico with the revolution, but it's the same series of questions. And it happens earlier in Mexico because of the intensity of those issues, because of its intense relationship with the United States. But we're going to look at now the entire region as it starts to question its place in the world and what it should be doing domestically as well as internationally.